Hello everyone and Assalamu alaikum. This is Introduction to Psychology Part 1 PSY 312 by Zero Knowledge. Okay, we have successfully completed the lesson 2 of chapter 5. So chapter 5 is all about perception, and we have successfully completed the lesson 1 and lesson 2 of perception. So if you haven't watched that video, I have given links in description. Go ahead, click on those links and watch those videos if you want to. Now in this video we'll start with the kinds of perception, and under the topic of kinds of perception, we will be discussing about the spatial perception, in which we'll discuss the perception of depth and distance, and after that we'll discuss the temporal perception, and in the end we'll discuss the auditory perception. So this lesson is going to be a bit long, so I've divided this lesson into parts. So this video will be the part 1 of lesson 3, and in part 1 of lesson 3 we will discuss the spatial perception, in which we'll discuss the perception of depth and distance in great detail. So let's start with our today's video. Depth perception. And in depth perception, what our first aim to know is how far is it. Now, human beings have been interested in the perception of objects in space at least since antiquity. Now, space perception is a process throughout which humans and other organisms become aware of the relative position of their own bodies and objects around them. Now, space perception is the perception of properties and relationship of objects in space. Especially with respect to direction, size, distance, and orientation. Now, it is the awareness of the position, size, form, distance, and direction of an object or of oneself. Now, space perception provides cues such as depth and distance, which we will be discussing in this video, that are important for movement and orientation to the environment. Now, today we'll be starting with the depth perception, and I've included a definition of depth perception. Now, the definition of depth perception is the use of visual cues to perceive the distance or three-dimensional characteristics of objects. Now, this is the definition of depth perception. Now, let's just discuss this term in more great detail. Now, the retina is two-dimensional surface, and it has up and down and a left and right, but no depth. Now, how is it then that we are able to perceive a three-dimensional world using two-dimensional retina? Now, the eye and the brain accomplish this remarkable task by using a number of two-dimensional cues to create a perceptual distance, which we'll be discussing in our video. Now, depth perception is basically our ability to perceive the distance of an object. And being able to perceive the distance of an object has a various survival value, especially regarding potential threats such as snarling dogs or oncoming trains. But simply walking through your house or apartment also requires that you accurately judge the distance of furniture, walls, other people, and so forth. Now, otherwise, you'd be constantly bumping into doors, walls, and tables, and the ability to perceive the distance of an object as well as the three-dimensional characteristics of an object is called depth perception. Now, depth perception have lots of benefits. Now, depth perception enables us to see the world in terms of an object located at various distances from us, and the world we live in is three-dimensional, and we can describe the size of an object around us in terms of their height, width, and depth. Now, we can also describe the distance in terms of how near or far, leftward or rightward, and high or low an object is from us. And we perceive the size and distance of an object in terms in the environment on the base of the images projected onto our retina. But the images themselves are flat. Now, one of the major questions the perception researchers have tried to answer is that how we perceive the three-dimensional properties of the world when the images on our retinas are only two-dimensional. Now, this is because of the great ability of the depth perception. Now, the depth perception include our innate and learned viewpoint. Now, innate, because we have some innate viewpoints about depth perceptions. This is also an innate, and there was one famous experiment which is called the visual cliff, and from that experiment it was concluded that depth perception is also an innate tendency of ours, and we are born with this we are blessed with depth perception. And it is also learned because as we grow up and we also learn about the depth perception in more great detail, we also learn about the distance of and objects and etc. So this was all about the depth perception, and now we will be discussing about the various types of the depth perception. The depth perception can be broadly classified into muscular cues, binocular cues, and monocular cues. Now you may have heard about monocular cues and binocular cues, but the muscular cue will be a new term for you because I have collected the material from different sources. I usually follow books because they're more authentic than following or searching on a website. So I prefer books than online sources. So I've collected the materials from different books, and in one a book of general psychology by Naima Khatun, the muscular cue was also included, so I decided to include it in my presentation too, to make a complete notes and complete lecture of depth perception. So we will be also discussing the muscular cues under the topic of depth perception, and here we have three types of cues which comes under the topic of depth perception. So let's start with the muscular cue. Now, muscular cue, the term muscular cue implies that these cues come from the body, and all images are projections of the three-dimensional world onto a two-dimensional surface, the retina. Now, if the visual system has to give us a good 3D size and distance of an object, it cannot rely on the projections of the retinal images, and it also relies on the process of convergence and accommodation. And convergence and accommodations are the terms which we'll be also discussing under the topic of binocular cue, and we'll also be discussing it under the topic of muscular cue because of some similarities and the need. Okay, as we have discussed that it also relies on the process of convergence and accommodation, and our eyes are connected to muscles that allow them to move and rotate. Now, when we look at an object, some of these muscles contract, causing the eyes to converge and look directly at the object. Now, the eyes converge more when they look at a closer or when they look at a closer object than when they look at an object that is far away. Now, some researchers believe that there are physiological sources of information for depth in the relationship between object, distance, object distance, convergence, and muscular effort. Now, in addition to the in addition to the muscles that move the eyes, there are also muscles attached to it that change the shape of the lens so that it can focus on different objects. Now, this is called accommodation, and We'll be also discussing it in great detail in this video under the topic of binocular cues. But the reason why this convergence and accommodation are specifically discussed under the topic of muscular cues, because muscles play a great role in accommodation and convergence. So that's why, according to general psychology by Naima Khatun, these terms are also discussed on the topic of muscular cues, and in other books you will also see these topics. You will also read these topics under the topic of binocular cues. Now, as we have discussed that this process, the accommodation, which we'll also be discussing in this video, just as with convergence, another physiological source of information for depth seems to be relationship between distance of an object and the accommodative processes of the lens. So this was all about the muscular cues, and now let's start with the monocular cues. I've included two definitions of monocular cues. The first one is that visual cues that can be seen from one eye and that allow us to perceive depth. And the second definition is distance or depth cues that can be processed by either eye alone. Now let's discuss this term in more or in great detail. Now, there are people who have lost the vision in one eye through accident or disease, but they still have the ability to perceive the sizes and distances of an object in the world. And you can prove it to yourself. Just close one eye and look around. It is a little more difficult to tell how far away things are and how much distance there is between them, but the world is not a flat or two-dimensional image. Now, this means that there are other sources of depth information, and these are called monocular cues for depth. And these include some other terms which we'll be discussing in this video. Now, let's discuss some terms that comes under the topic of monocular cue. Monocular cue basically under the topic of monocular cue, we'll be discussing a texture gradient, linear perspective, overlap, and shadowing, and it's also called light and shadow. And after that, we'll be discussing the motion parallax, and then we'll discuss speed of movement, or you can say movement. And after that, we'll discuss Ariel or atmospheric perspective, and then we'll discuss aerial perspective and relative height. And after that, we'll discuss height in horizontal plane, and after that we will discuss relative size, and in the end we'll discuss relative clarity or clearness. So let's start with the texture gradient. Now, texture gradient is as a surface with a distinct texture extends into the distance, the details of the surface texture gradually becomes less clearly defined, and the texture of the surface seems to undergo a gradient or continuous pattern of change, from crisp and distinct when close to fuzzy and blended when farther away. Now, a texture gradient are the monocular cue provided by or proximity to an object. Now, the closer one is to something, the more detail or texture one can see. For example, if you look at a wall from 20 feet distance, it will look fairly smooth wall, but as we approach the wall, we begin to see more and more details or textures. Now, when we are right up against the wall, we can see things that we couldn't see earlier when farther away. Now, that correlation between distance and texture is interpreted as a distant cue. And it is also called texture gradient or texture, and in some books you will read them as gradient texture, and in some book you will read them as gradients of texture, because the texture of a surface appears smoother as the distance increases, and a gradient is a continuous change in something, and a change without abrupt transitions. A gradual change from a coarse or a rough texture to a fine, indistinct texture signals increasing distance. Now, farther away an object is, the more less textured it will be, more densely packed it will be, and the region closest to the observer will have many details as distance increases. Now the texture becomes finer and brain information can be used to produce an experience. So this was all about the texture gradient, and the next term is the linear perspective. Now, parallel lines, according to the linear perspective of monocular cue, the parallel lines seem to meet in the distance. And for example, if you stand in the middle of a railroad track and look down the rail, you will notice that the parallel lines or parallel rails seem to meet in the distance. Now, the closer together the lines appear to be, the greater the perception of distance there is. You will perceive. Now, this was all about the linear perspective of the texture gradient, and Ponzo illusion is also one of the terms that is discussed under the topic of linear perspective. And according to Ponzo illusion, the closer together the lines appear to be, the greater the perception of the distance there is, or there, yes, perception of distance. The next topic is about the overlap, and according to overlap, in some books you will read this as simple overlap of objects, and in some books you will read them as superposition, interposition, or superimposition. So the term may varies, but the lectures or the notes are same. Now, according to overlap, when one object partially blocks or obscures the view of another object, the partly blocked object is perceived as being farther away. Now, if one object overlaps another, it is seen as being closer than the one it covers. Now, overlap or interposition describes the phenomena in which objects close to us tend to block out part of objects that are farther away from us. Now, interposition occurs when one object is blocked by another, and interposition occurs when object obstruct or weave of another, and when an object is superimposed upon another, partly hiding it, the superimposed object will appear to be nearer. And if one object partly or partially blocks or weave of another, we perceive it as closer. And when one object is completely visible while another is partly covered by it, the first object is perceived as nearer. Now, this is all about the overlap, and the next topic is shadowing, and it is also discussed under the topic of light and shadows. According to shadowing, nearby objects reflect more light to our eyes. Uh, Thus, given two identical objects, the dimmer one seems the farther away, and shadows has the effect of pushing darker parts of an image, and shading too produce a sense of depth consistent with the assumed light source, because our brain follow a simple rule. Assume that light comes from above and hide lights bringing other parts forward. So increasing the three-dimensional effect, this illusion can also contribute to accidents when a fog shrouded vehicles or one with only its parking lights on seems farther away than it is. And shadows are differences in the illumination of an image and helps us to see 3D objects by the shadows they cast. So if something is 3D, it will cast a shadow, and if it is 2D, it won't. Now the next topic is about motion parallax, and it is also discussed as or also known as relative motion. According to this term, which comes under the topic of monocular cue, when you are moving, you use the speed of passing object to estimate the distance of the objects. Now, nearby objects seem to zip by faster than do the distant objects. And when riding on a consumer train, for example, house and parked cars along with tracks seem to whiz by, while the distant downtown skyline seems to move very slowly. Now, motion parallax. When we travel in a vehicle, objects far away appear to move in the same direction as the observer, whereas close objects move in the opposite direction. Also, objects at a different distance appear to move at different velocities. Now, this was all about relative motion, and sometimes you will discuss it as only motion parallax, and in some books you will discuss them as relative motion. Then the next topic is about speed of movement, and it is also known as movement in some books. Now, according to this term, when you move your head, you will observe that the objects in your visual field move relative to you and to one another. Now, if you watch closely, you will find that objects nearer to you than the spot at which you're looking, the fixation point, moving in a direction opposite to the direction in which your head is moving. Now, on the other hand, objects more distant than the fixation point moves in the same direction as your head moves. Now, the direction of movement of objects when we turn our heads can be a cue for the relative distance of objects. And furthermore, the amount of movement is less for far objects than it is for near ones. And we do not usually think about this through we experience it unaware. Now, the next topic is the aerial perspective or aerial or atmospheric perspective. According to this, farther away or far away objects often appear hazy or slightly blurred by the atmosphere. Now, objects that are far away appear fuzzier or vague than those close by because as distance increases, smoke, dust, and haze reduce the clarity of the projected image, and this depth cue can sometimes cause us to judge a distance inaccurately, especially if we are accustomed to the smoky atmosphere of urban areas. Mm, Aerial perspective acts as a depth cue over long distance when we are outside, and smoke, dust, fog, and haze add to the apparent distance of an object, and the same scene will provide quite different perceptual experience depending on the presence or absence of haze. Now, for example, you look out at the mountain, and on a clear day when there is no haze, the mountain seems so close that you can touch them. And naively, you might even suggest that you walk to the mountain, but you are told it is 75 miles away. Now, had you first looked at the mountain on a hazy day, and it would not have seemed so close, and aerial perspective thus makes distant objects seem hazier and washed out in color and lacking in detail. Now, the next topic is about aerial perspective or relative height. And according to this, we perceive an object higher in our field of vision as farther away. We perceive objects higher in our field as farther away because field of vision as farther away. And below the horizon, objects lower down in our field of vision are perceived as closer. And above the horizon, objects higher up are seen as closer. Now, lower objects seem closer and thus are usually perceived as figure. And relative height may usually contribute to the illusion that vertical dimensions are longer than the identical dimensions. Now, the next topic is about the height in the horizontal plane, and according to this, this is also known as height in the picture plane. And according to this, when an objects are on the ground, the farther away they appear to be below the horizon, the closer they appear to us. And for objects in the air, the farther they appear to be above the horizon, the closer they appear to be to us. Now, distant objects seems to be higher and nearer objects lower in the horizontal plane, and we perceive points nearer to the horizon as more distant than the points that are farther away from the horizon. And this means that below the horizon, objects higher in the visual field appear farther away than those that are lower. And above the horizon, objects lower in the visual field appear farther away than those that are higher, and this depth cue is called relative height. Now, it is also called height in the picture plane because objects that are higher up or close to the horizon line in a drawing tend to look farther away than the other objects in the figure. And the next topic is about the relative size, and according to relative size, it is an interesting monocular cue because our learning contributes heavily to this cue. Over the years, we have learned that objects on our planet change size slowly, if at all. And in other words, it is not the case that people shrink to half their size or double their size in an eye blink. They do not. If they did, we would not be able to tell whether they were shrinking or moving away, or whether they were growing or coming closer. But we do not have that problem. Instead, when the image of an object gets larger on the retina, we interpret that as distant cue or distance cue, as closer one. And when the image on the retina gets smaller, we interpret that object as farther away, and the rear tiles on the floor or the trees in the background look smaller than the one that is nearby, if you have noticed in the picture. So in a nutshell, according to relative size, if two or more objects are assumed to be similar in size, the object that appears larger is perceived as being closer. Now, the next topic is about the relative clarity or clearness. According to this topic, objects which are nearer or closer appear to be clearer and more well defined than those in the distance. And the more clearly we see an object, the nearer it seems to be. And because light from distant object passes through more atmosphere, we perceive hazy objects as farther away and sharp clear objects. Now, this is all about the clarity, and the next term is about binocular cues. We have discussed monocular cue in great detail and all its types, all the topics that comes under the monocular cues. Now, the next term is about binocular cues. And one thing I would like to discuss here is the monocular cue is also known as secondary cue, and binocular cue is known as primary cue. I've included two definitions of binocular cue. The first one is distant or depth cues that require the use of both eyes, or the visual cues that require both eyes to allow us to perceive depth. Now, binocular cues, they're also known as primary cues, and they operate through a mechanism of interaction of both eyes to produce depth perception. As the two eyes are set apart, each of them has a slightly different view of the world. Uh, as I've discussed, that they are also called primary cues, and we also rely heavily on binocular cue, which is depth information based on the coordinated effort of both eyes, and it refers to those depth cues in which both eyes are needed to perceive, and these require both eyes. Seeing with both eyes provides important binocular cues for depth perception. Now, there are different types of binocular cues, and binocular cues are the retinal disparity, which is also known as binocular disparity, and after that we'll discuss the convergence and accommodation, which we have also discussed it under the topic of monocular muscular cue, but we'll be discussing it under the topic of binocular cues because it also comes under the topic of binocular cues because it include our both of our eyes. So let's start with the retinal disparity. Now, our two eyes are separated by a little more than 2 inches, and this separation gives each eye a slight different view of the world, and this can be demonstrated by closing the left eye and holding out the thumb so that one eye is hidden behind the other. And if you now switch eyes, you will notice that you can see a bit of your far thumb at the edge of the near one. And when the image from the both eyes are fused together, the result is powerful sensation of depth, and objects that are within 25 feet project images to different location on the right and left retina. Now, the separation between the images of these objects in the two eyes is known as retinal disparity. The closer the object, the greater the retinal disparity. And retinal disparity is greater when an object is near you than when it is farther away from you. And certain cells in the visual cortex detect the degree of retinal disparity, which the brain uses to estimate the distance of an object focused on the retinas. And retinal disparity, which we have already discussed right here, the next topic which we'll be discussing is convergence. Which is another important binocular distance cue or cue to distance is a phenomena called convergence, and convergence refers to the fact that the closer an object, the more inward our eyes need to turn in order to focus. Now, the farther our eyes converge, the closer an object appears to be, and in order to see close objects, our eyes turn inward towards one another, and the greater this movement, the closer such objects appear to be. Now, convergence is a neuromuscular cue. It is caused by the eyes greater inward turn when they view a near object. Now, when we look at an object that is no more than 25 feet away, or two eyes must converge or rotate to the side in order to perceive it as a single, clearly focused image, and this rotation of the eye is necessary to allow them to focus on the same object, but it creates tension in the eye muscle. And convergence does not depend on the retinal image in the two eyes, but on the muscle tension that results from the external eye muscles that control eye movement. And the next term which we'll be discussing is accommodation. Now, accommodation involves the lens of the eye altering its shape in order to focus the image more accurately on the retina, and ciliary muscles contract to elongate the lens and focus upon more distant objects. Relax to allow it to become more rounded and focus upon nearer objects. Data are fed or sent to the brain from kinesthetic senses in these ciliary muscles, providing information about nearer or distant or a nearness or distance of the object focused upon. So this was all about today's video. If I would like to say something about depth perception or depth perception cue, so depth perception cue help to create different illusions like moon illusions and other geometric illusions. size and shape constancy, habitual eye movement, continuity, and perceptual habits also help in the formation of illusions, which we'll be discussing in our next upcoming videos. So this was about today's video. If your concept is clear, you can like the video. If not, you can ask us in the comment section and we'll be happy to help you out. Plus, if you're new to this channel and you want to stay notified for the upcoming videos, you can subscribe to our channel, click on the bell notification so you will never ever miss any notification from us. And you can share the link of this video, link of this channel with your family members and friends, because sharing is caring. Until then, Allah Hafiz.